all including Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler. Good morning, Len. What's kind of your biggest news headline this morning when you wake up?
Good morning, Nina and crew. I'm happy to be here with you. It was a historic election in a lot of ways. We've talked a lot about all the things, the coronavirus, and the fact that there was no competitive presidential race, so that affected the race something. But the I think the headlines are that Oregonians made some historic choices, and they also went towards they chose experience over kind of the either ends of the political spectrum. So you have real wins by a guy named Mark Haas, who runs for the Secretary of State's race, a real win by Clef Vance, who's the Republican head in the congressional district, out to replace Walden. Then you've got locally, you've got Ted Wheeler. I think people think that he won a historic race and outright in the primary. And then you have Carmen Rubio elected to, in a historic way, first Latinx, but also in some ways kind of sets the stage for a city council that could have possibly 4 women on it and Ted Wheeler. So we've got a lot of history still in front of us.
All right, so let's go back to the mayor's race, because Sarah Iannarone is nipping at his heels, and she has said that when all this is official, she thinks that he is not going to have enough support over that 50% mark to avoid a runoff in November. Any predictions?
Well, I think that's what her plans were all along. We were trying to take the mayor in to a general election, but I thought the numbers were holding up pretty well during the evening. Regardless of that, what you have to say is this was a real victory for Ted Wheeler. I think he came out of a kind of a mixed bag first term, demonstrating a lot of leadership during the coronavirus. I think most people kind of give him a lot of credit for being a trusted leader during tough times. So I think those numbers are going to hold up. But, Sarah could be right. And if so, that would be an interesting race. The general election is a different electorate. It's usually about twice the size of the number of voters that show up in a primary. So it's hard to predict what a runoff would do, but I'm sure Wheeler would love to have it all over right now.
It's certainly close enough to talk about this morning, right, Len? And real quickly, just if you could clarify, we showed the numbers a moment ago. Mayor Wheeler with 51% of the vote right now. So if he's sitting at 50%, is that enough to cause a runoff, or would that be still enough for him to be safe? Does it have to fall below 50%, or is 50 the number?
Good question, Drew. I think it's the way we kind of talk about this in shorthand is it's 50% plus 1. So it's just kind of he has to be over the 50% in a nonpartisan race. But that's a very important issue you raise.
So I think we have a great, and when you guys watching, Len is a fantastic political source. He's been in the game a long time. If you have any election questions, if you have questions about a result, I've got our page pulled up right here. I can give those to you. Michelle Krantz on Facebook asks a great question, Len. And this is for a lot of us who maybe pretend to know the answer, but here she's going to ask. Why don't we ask about how Oregon is a closed primary? A lot of people don't seem to know that and might be ripping up their ballots because of this. Kind of explain what a closed primary means.
In Oregon, we allow Democrats to vote for their choice to be their standard bearer, and we allow Republicans to do the same thing. Those who are non-affiliated independents or whatever come together in a different format. And we've seen that in the Secretary of State's race, actually, this time around, where they not only held a separate vote, but they did electronically, the online voting, rather than have a convention for the independents. There's, reformers fight about this all the time, but the Democrats, the argument goes that the Democrats should be able to have their person representing them, and it gives the voters some clarity as to what they're getting, and to setting up the general election as a choice between philosophies. A lot of people, though, the reformers, are moving towards having a top 2 election, or an election in which people make a forced choice selection where they pick their first choice, second choice, third choice, so that all the results come in. If the first person doesn't win the entire race, then that goes out. Or the top 2 people win regardless of their party. We see that in both California, quite frankly, and Washington. But Oregonians like the idea of picking, a standard bearer going forward.
So, Lynn, is there anything that surprised you as far as a measure or a candidate, somebody who won or didn't, some measure that passed or didn't? Is there anything that kind of sticks out to you?
It's a great question. I think, Brenda, and people will be poring over the results over the next couple of days. For me, the biggest thing was the homeless measure. That was the measure that Metro put up, 26-10. You have to say that that was historic in the sense that in the midst of this crisis, Oregonians in the Tri-County area put their money where their mouth is. Everybody says that homelessness is the number one blatant, most egregious problem we have to resolve if we're going to have a social justice in our community. And here was an effort to tax Oregonians to put together a bucket of money to be able to address the problem. It's the second step, if you will, of the problem. Metro put forward a housing bond last cycle, 2018. And so now this says, let's get some services, money for services in place for those folks. I think it was a dramatic vote for optimism by Oregonians in the midst of kind of the chaos of the pandemic and the economic anxiety that Oregonians are feeling. For them to say yes to this measure is a big deal. The campaign that put this together is to be applauded for the way in which they got this on the measure and the way they fought it through. But voters really should pat themselves on the back for taking a historic positive step.
Len, you mentioned the pandemic already a couple of times just in the first 10 minutes of our conversation. Jennifer Taft is watching us right now on Facebook. Good morning, Jennifer. And she brings it up as well. She says she strongly thinks that Mayor Ted Wheeler benefited from the pandemic because she says that nobody in the middle of something like this wants to switch streams and put a new guy in place. And I kind of had the opposite feeling in terms of the entire election season and the election year, that because we're all sort of in this phase of, man, things need to get back to normal or things need to get better. That's really it. Things need to get better than they are right now, that would actually cause people to want a change. So do you have any thoughts on that one way or the other, whether the pandemic could be influencing people's decisions right now?
Really a big question, Drew. I think a lot of people are going to be talking about that over the next couple of weeks as they sort through all the results. So the pandemic did a couple of things. It certainly changed, it disrupted our lives, made people feel more isolated and perhaps more self-reflective, anxious about their own lives and livelihood. And that would tend to kind of take people out of the political spectrum and maybe not participate. We didn't have that. Oregonians really did participate in large numbers. In the case of the choice of do you pick experience or not, if you look at a couple of these races, you'd have to say that people picked experience. They picked Ted Wheeler as the experienced hand, leadership in tough times, rather than someone who was a little bit more of an insurgent candidacy. They picked Mark Haas, who was more experienced and ran on a experience in tough times kind of measure in the Democratic primary. They picked Clef Benz, who the voters in the second congressional district thought they knew more than the other people who were changing around in front of them in their eyes in the campaign. And they picked Carmen Rubio, let's say, even though she's a historic Latinx, first time elected to the city council, she was clearly the much more experienced person in that race. So there was a flight towards experience. The pandemic, I'm sorry to talk on here, Drew, but it's a very interesting topic. This was a challenge for incumbents because, quite frankly, you could fall flat on your face. These are big, historic forces that you were battling, and yet Wheeler seemed to rise to the top during this time. Unlike his first term in office, he seemed to have focus, purpose, really demonstrated leadership, got other governments to kind of get in line with him. He really rose to the top in tough times. And so I think that your viewer's question opens up a really interesting discussion, but I think that people move towards experience and leadership in tough times.
Len, I don't know how much expertise you have about the DA's race, and a lot of people may not pay attention at all. They're like, oh, it's like some lawyer, he's going to work in the courts, he's the head of, the district attorney's office, like, eh. But this really has repercussions for all of us of, who stays behind bars, who goes to jail, who goes to prison. Mike Schmidt, overwhelmingly won. This was supposed to be a close race, and Mike Schmidt is a big sea change in this office that only 2 people have held in, what, 40 years, I think I was just reading. Can you explain like his philosophical differences and maybe why voters wanted to go that way?
Good question. And last night during our panel, when we had Nkenge Carmen Johnson on, she really expressed this in ways that were very dramatic and moving to me. I mean, she felt that this was a race in which social justice was on the ballot because Mike Schmidt had his entire career, even though he did some prosecuting, he was someone in favor of a much more progressive view of the office and of justice in general. He likes to use data rather than intuitiveness about the way in which the system works. He chooses not to go after certain kinds of crimes. The DA has very significant role in shaping the kind of justice system that we have in our region. And then because he's Multnomah County's DA, he has a big voice on state criminal justice and social justice policies statewide. So Mike Schmidt will be somebody we'll be hearing from, and he clearly is on the progressive side and that's what the voters wanted overwhelmingly.
Yeah, a lot more on like treatment and supervision versus, you know, just doing the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines.
And that's a movement nationwide. And Oregon has a more progressive set of DAs than maybe that we'd find in other parts of the country. But this will be a particularly noticeable that Mike Schmidt will become a leader, I think, in the thought as well as the practice of social justice.
Len, anything particularly consequential from the primary that you can see carrying through to the general election in November?
Yeah, let's, without getting too abstract, because these are obviously races about individuals, but women and people of color seem to do very well in this election. We have races up and down the ballot. We talked about Carmen Rubio, but there are Lisa Reynolds, Fan Khan, and in the east side of Portland. There were a number of these kinds of races where women and people of color rose to kind of the victory in this race. So we're going to see that movement more and more. A group called Emerge has produced about 54 women candidates, recruited them and supported them. So we're going to see women as an increasingly important part of our elections in Oregon. And as I said earlier, it could be that the city council will have 4 women on it. I also thought it was not a great day for public employee unions. When you think about the union-backed candidates, they really wanted Shemia Fagan rather than Mark Haas. They wanted the challengers against a couple of state representatives, and they lost in those. I think internally, and as we go forward into the general election, and more importantly, perhaps in the legislature, the public employees will have a little bit less hold on, even if the Democrats have a supermajority, because they challenged some Democratic incumbents in ways that probably didn't win them a lot of friends. Overall, though, I think there'll be some surprising pairings in the city council race that we'll be talking about, and it'll make the Portland City Council still a focus of our attention going forward in terms of the direction that they take. And then I want to come back to this homeless measure. This was really significant. It was I think a real positive step, and a vote for optimism.
Len, the nation was watching that particular measure here in Portland. It wasn't just Oregon.
Good point.
I think you're right. I think this one will set us apart, and will be the thing that people, when they kind of look back at the election and say, wow, that was awfully impressive for Oregon to take this positive step in the middle of this pandemic.
And do you know, I was reading, our reporter Maggie Vespa is our, go-to on homeless issues in the metro area, and she was writing that, this was intentionally written very broadly in how they can use the money. And especially now that we're in this pandemic, everything was written, well before this economic recession. Is that, because we were showing yesterday, we talked about this homeless measure here on Extra, and I was showing people how the Oregonian editorial board had said, good governance would actually bring a no vote on this because it uses a lot of money for administration costs in how they collect the taxes, and and just, really it doesn't spell out exactly what it's going to and how many people will be helped. It didn't seem to be an issue with most voters. I wonder what the breakdown is of like who voted one way, who's actually going to pay the tax, because it is higher income earners. But do you think that broadness of the way it was written helps it or makes it more kind of prone to issues in the future?
Yeah, great question. And Maggie's done a really great job getting into the, kind of the emotional human story of this homelessness. Really good stuff. And last night's stories were like that for me anyway. So Metro, first of all, this is, they were criticized because of the accountability measures, although they would say the people who put the measure together said they worked for a couple of years trying to build in accountability functions. They clearly crafted the measures so that it would be a tax on almost everybody else, so that voters made a positive step, but they were saying, okay, let's make the rich pay their fair share. Let's make businesses that are doing okay pay their fair share towards a problem we all acknowledge has got to get done. So it's up to Metro now to kind of have a lot more accountability. It's interesting that some of our bigger issues are shifting to this metropolitan elected government as opposed to some of the local governments. They had a big housing bond. They had this homeless measure. They're going to go forward with a transportation bond. And if you watch the way they work, they really work very hard to try and build in public involvement, public engagement, and accountability. So I have a feeling that this measure is going to get organized in a way that Oregonians will say, yeah, the money's being spent well. But at this point, it is an issue that you raise because it is a matter that brought the no endorsement from the Oregonian and other places. Luckily for the measure, Oregonians looked past that and said, we've got to tackle this problem, and this is the right tool to tackle this problem.
Len, I'm looking at the Facebook live stream right now. Lots of questions pouring in from our viewers, questions that I know you could answer better than I can. So how about this one from Jim Marr? He speaks specifically to the Oregon Education Association, asking how big a defeat did the Oregon Education Association suffer last night, in your opinion?
Well, that's what I'm glad for the question, because I was trying to formulate the words, but when the OEA is a very important organization in Oregon politics, particularly in Democratic politics. I mean, they represent the collective organizational might of teachers in public instruction. So they're a very important voice, both in elections and in public policy. So they're not to be discounted. Any one election won't erode the history of their positive involvement in our education of our kids and what have you. However, when you look at the specific results here, and the endorsements that OEA made, they wanted you to vote for Shemia Fagan rather than Mark Haas, and they lost that one. They wanted you to vote for a number of different individual legislators, and they lost those races up and down the ticket. I think this was really a serious blow towards their political agenda. It's not an attack on teachers or anything like that, or I think Oregonians continue to embrace education. But if your questioner is specifically saying is the OEA as strong today as it was yesterday, I would have to say politically they have a little bit less clout. You'll remember this because the public employee unions a couple of years back took after a guy named Greg McPherson and a couple of other legislators who took a whack at some of the PERS problem. They shaved back or reformed some of the things that have to do with our public employee retirement system. And the public employee unions, the OEA, SEIU, and AFSCME, all just said that's the third rail in Oregon politics. You touch that, and we're gonna get you out of office. And they did that with a couple of really good public officials. This guy Greg McPherson was running for Attorney General in 2008. This year, they said the same thing because of the way in which last legislative session took on some modest reforms. And they said, we're going to make you pay a penalty. This is payback time. And in fact, they were not able to carry through on that. So there are going to be some legislators who come into Salem next time. Even if the Democrats are in charge, we're going to hold the OEA and some of the public employees to a stricter standard, maybe of proof than they did just last election cycle.
Len, we have covered many, many elections together. they just get wilder, you know, and now you add in this pandemic. Boy, systemically, it has totally changed how we do things. You know, speaking of Maggie Vespa, she did a story the other day about voting booths in a nightclub. You know, we already do mail-in ballots. Do you think that in this state and beyond, that it's going to change the way campaigns are run and how they're executed?
Clearly, it will have an impact. It's a great story and a great analogy. I love that story when I was watching it. So the pandemic changed a lot of things, but it made people really nostalgic for what they love about Oregon politics, which is on the doorstep. First of all, if you're on the doorstep, there's a chance that you're going to make a contact with a voter and bring, listen to their issues and also bring them to the fore. And an elected person who goes through that kind of intense campaigning is a better candidate and a better office holder, I believe, and I think Oregonians love that kind of campaigning. It also is more difficult for insurgent campaigns or people who are new and not traditional candidates to get the traction that they need or the energy that they need. You could say that Sarah Iannarone was a candidate who was waiting for the energy of the electorate to kind of carry her forward, and with a depressed electorate in the primary, because there wasn't a presidential primary, and without a lot of driving force at the top of the ticket, and with the pandemic keeping her from having the kind of contact that she probably thrives on, that you have an insurgent candidate not able to get quite the same kind of traction. So it changed the way people look at campaigns and the way they had to. It also brought out some different brands in some of the office holders. I mean, you saw a different kind of leadership, people willing to be a little bit more compassionate than just egocentric as office holders, or talking about the problems of the voters rather than their own credentials. And it really changed messaging as well as the mechanics of campaigns. In some ways, people will be nostalgic for the old thing, but in some ways, people say, wow, we learned something about the technology that allows us to cover a lot more. I was really impressed with Rebecca Tweed last night on our panel, where she said that the 2nd Congressional District, which is so spacious and spread out, was served by these Zoom centers and the Zoom meetings, and allowed candidates to get in touch with a lot more people. It's an interesting thought. And so the new technologies will be kind of ladled into what's best about our Oregon politics, which I think is the door-to-door. And I hope we don't lose that, once we're able to kind of get back in touch with people after this pandemic is worked its way through.
Len, we could use like this much more time for the discussion. Unfortunately, we have this much time. Oh, we have no time. We do have to run. Sunrise Extra is through for a Wednesday morning, but we thank Len Bergstein for joining us. He is our go-to guy when it comes to election night coverage and all things local politics. So thank you again, Len, for joining us here on Sunrise Extra. We'll bring you a Thursday edition tomorrow. We hope to see you then.